Let's take you back to Sanddton Convention Centre, where SABC News anchor Mfundo Mabalane is standing by with the latest. Mfundo, it's back to you.
Thank you very much, Liesl. Yes, we are still here at the Sanddton Convention Centre. We're now joined by climate investor Ameer Ibrahim. Ameer, good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me today.
No, it's most certainly a pleasure. Perhaps to start with your reaction to Standard Bank's commitment of 250 billion towards renewables that we heard yesterday.
So I think this marks a very material development in relation to South Africa's commitment to actually being a leader in relation to the energy transition going forward. As we understood from the CEO yesterday afternoon in his comments that were made to the leaders of the BRICS countries, there is certainly a very clear agenda going forward for financial institutions here within South Africa to play a key role in ensuring the energy transition will be supported in the future. It marks certainly a very significant and symbolic reflection of South Africa's commitment within a financial context to ensure that there will be sustainability projects supported going forward.
But even though you may say there is great commitment, our president has consistently stated that it must be a just transition. These sentiments echoed by a number of other developing nations, where they're saying the unique situation of each and every country must be taken into account, so the pace would not be similar. What is your take on just that emphasis?
So certainly there are differences that exist within different countries regarding how approaches to mitigate the impacts of climate change will be integrated into economic development, infrastructure development and industrial policy going forward. I think certainly one of the key areas where there is international consensus does relate to the fact that governance systems in relation to how we support climate change and the principles in which, in looking at how sustainable development in the future will be supported. These are key areas where there is, generally speaking, consensus, I would say, across the BRICS and within the broader international community. The significance of the financial commitment does also signify that for future projects, climate and sustainability will be a key area in relation to the criterion going forward and looking at how new development projects will be financed. So I think Mr. Ramaphosa, the president here in South Africa, certainly has recognised that climate is a key area in relation to multilateral engagement and economic development going forward. But indeed his comments around the fact that different nations will have different needs and also will approach certainly the way in which they integrate climate development into their future plans is something where there will be specific differences between different countries.
But another thing that he stated was that perhaps they need to push for the more industrialized economies to honor their commitment to assist the emerging economies.
Yes, and certainly that is something that has been on the agenda at other multilateral forums, including the United Nations COP summits that take place annually. As we know, this year the COP28 summit will be taking place in Dubai within the UAE, one of the aspiring members to join the BRICS bloc. And indeed, Brazil is going to be hosting COP30 in the Amazonian region in 2025, as was confirmed just a few months ago. So the financial commitments from developed countries to support developing countries in meeting their energy transition needs and indeed in ensuring that their goals in relation to mitigating the impacts of climate change are achieved is certainly a key area that does have to continue to be strived for. As we have seen previously, the $100 billion a year commitment from developed countries, has not been met previously, and that is something where there does have to be future commitments to ensure that these aspirations for developing countries to be more sustainable going forward are achieved. Other examples of where sustainability is being integrated into the financial agenda also is reflected through this summit, We additionally heard from the current leader of the New Development Bank.
Yeah.
And certainly the projects that are being pursued within the New Development Bank, which is headquartered in Shanghai, do have a key focus on sustainability. And I think that is a positive area where leadership from the BRICS bloc currently is being aligned to the commitments regarding the Sustainable Development Goals and climate change going forward.
Now, beyond this particular conversation around the just transition, there's also been a number of conversations, one in particular being that of the expansion of BRICS. I think with just today, we're not necessarily certain as to where they stand. We do know that they are all for it, the expansion, but nevertheless, we don't know insofar as those very private talks that they're having, if indeed the end of this summit will see some sort of a bold announcement that indeed they will be admitting some of those that indicated that they'd like to join BRICS.
So the commentary yesterday that we all heard from President Cyril Ramaphosa, who highlighted that the BRICS community have recognised that there certainly are key aspirations from a very diverse contingent base of countries from across the world to join the BRICS community, is something that is broadly positive. You know, it shows that the BRICS bloc currently does reflect an opportunity for other developing and emerging economies. And it's very interesting, that terminology, that developing and emerging economies are both integrated into how BRICS represents itself, is something that actually has shown positive developments, which is why over 40 countries, both formally, I believe it's over 20, have officially signified that they wish to join BRICS, and over 40 have signified through conversation and other means that they would aspire to join BRICS. Shows that there certainly are key positive areas of synergies and alignment where other international countries can actually engage with the bloc. What's very interesting about the aspiring countries that seek to join is that they are very diverse in nature. You have countries that have very different, I suppose, rates of development, if you will. You have countries that have different economic context.
And political systems.
And political systems, absolutely. And we've seen countries such as Argentina formally expressed an interest to join, and indeed we have seen countries such as Saudi and the UAE, which currently have, you could argue, economic prosperity, but they still recognise key alignment with some of the objectives of the BRICS community. One of the other, I think, key points that President Ramaphosa made yesterday, and also some of the sentiment expressed by Chinese President Xi Jinping, was around the fact that the BRICS Forum does not seek to replace existing multilateral forums that currently are looking to also pursue positive international development. So the BRICS, community is not seeking to replace the G7, and that is very interesting to hear some of that sentiment being expressed. What certainly has been signified is that those countries that do seek membership of the community recognise that they have key areas of economic and other forms of governance development that reciprocate some of the key challenges and opportunities that existing members of the BRICS community
When you touch on
hold.
the G7, though, I know you're saying that most of them have expressed that there's no desire to compete with the G7. But nevertheless, you have heard one leader after another, particularly Lula, as well as Vladimir Putin. They've stated that fact that here, when you look at BRICS, it now has surpassed the purchasing power parity of G7. So one would say, even though the conversation around perhaps strengthening BRICS to rival a G7, they would say it's not even a conversation, it's a non-starter. But nevertheless, they are noting whatever is happening within G7 and noting that they have surpassed it at this point. So wouldn't you say there is some subtle competition there?
So certainly, if you look at the subtle inferences around whether or not this is something that should be recognised through a competitive lens, or certainly something that should be looked at as a lens where different multilateral forums from around the world can seek greater international development, prosperity for all countries going forward, I think that is something that certainly could be interpreted differently by different groups. What is significant, though, is that the current membership, just in its current form, so not considering expansion at this time, because there's been no formal commitment to expansion, as President Ramaphosa referenced yesterday. So the BRICS community currently make up more than 40% of the global population, and indeed currently surpass more than a quarter of global GDP.
Yes.
Indeed, as you mentioned, purchasing power parity, and depending on the economic measurements used, has already surpassed some other multilateral forums such as the G7. But I think what is significant is looking at what are the key areas of commonality that exist amongst the current BRICS membership and indeed those that are aspiring to join, and how can this lead to greater cooperation going forward. And I think looking at this through the lens of, I suppose, rivalry or indeed some form of polarization that may develop in the future is certainly concerning. You know, as President Ramaphosa highlighted yesterday, there was non-alignment that was a key area of political, I suppose, reference, particularly during the Cold War, of many nation states within the global south and indeed here within the African continent. And that was very much, I suppose, a symbolic reference to the fact that there was not this I suppose, determination for many states to either align with the West or the East, but certainly looking at how the global community could come together. And I think that what is important to recognise are where there are areas of mutual cooperation and indeed development that can be achieved going forward. Yes, there is economic competition that exists, and indeed even amongst BRICS countries, if you look at certainly economic marketplaces that are, and looking at trade and development, competition is something that exists.
Or maybe they're just sort of aspiring to have a stronger voice, that here they want that geopolitical influence as a bloc, that within BRICS they perhaps do aspire to be as influential as a G7, not necessarily as rivals, but to get that voice as well.
I think certainly there has been reference to the fact that many states do wish to see further representation and a greater voice that has not historically been supported. And I think certainly that there would be international consensus that the more the global community can actually be represented is a positive thing in the 21st century. There were references certainly yesterday to historic ills, in relation to looking at the impact of colonialization that has happened in many countries and how this has potentially acted as a barrier to actually have greater representation on the global stage. And indeed, if BRICS is serving to help support countries that have not had as much representation as should have been promoted within the international community, that is something that is positive to see, how other states that have not had that representation historically can be integrated. But the one area that I think is very important to recognise, and one thing that has been expressed during this forum, and indeed within every other multilateral forum that has taken place in recent years, is the fact that climate change is something of mutual importance, and
Most
indeed,
certainly.
and this is something that every single country, not just every country, on the micro level, every individual is a stakeholder of. This is something that affects every single person in the world. And indeed, anything that goes to support the mitigation of climate change going forward and looking at how we can find an energy transition to support net zero and achieving a sustainable future is a positive for the global community, not only those that are members of BRICS or the G7, but all countries around the world.
No, most certainly. Ameer, thank you very much for your time. That's
Thank you.
climate investor Ameer Ibrahim.